Hi, and welcome to the second chapter of my biography. Well, I said I wouldn't get too emotional, but it did end up a little emotional at the last one, so sorry about that. I'll try to be honest in my feelings about whatever I'm talking of. And this is really talking now about my earlier adolescent years, coming out of childhood, really. And I just reflect a little bit about my early childhood before that, really. It was a very mixed childhood, really. There was a lot of good and bad, a lot of happy and sad memories from those times. Yes, a lot of the time, I think I'd spent some time alone, really, not sure and not knowing how to relate to others for a lot of the time. But there were a lot more times that were with others as well, really. And the foster father was very attentive. He was very kind and considerate. I know he was quite busy a lot of the time, but when he was with us, he was very actually attentive. He worked with us. We worked out with him sometimes doing leafleting. And we used to go out with the animals, walking the dog with him, and go to the local park. And so quite often, yeah, we had lots of times when we were happy going out to the parks, going out playing in the garden, or just doing some jigsaw puzzle or playing some sort of game as a family. Sometimes we did have happier family times as well. And we had lots of family holidays, full of lots of happy memories as well. Lots of those were going off with both the foster parents and all the foster children, the four of us as there were, for a longer time, going off to different, there were different church gatherings, activity holidays that we went on, to a whole variety, and meeting lots of families that we'd known and were close to. I think they had lots of church friends, the foster parents, that we were very close to, and some that I got on well with, and a few others I didn't know so well, if I'm honest. But there were lots of people in their life, and I had a few close friends at the time anyway. I had a few close friends over the years that I was able to see. There were a lot of happy memories with that, with Richard, the foster parent, um, and also with Christine sometimes. I know we had our difficulties in our struggle with each other sometimes. And there was a strain in that relationship, yes, you know, but I think we couldn't always get along closely all the time. And sometimes there were issues with it. But there were a lot of happy memories also, and a lot of good things that I learnt from the foster family. Learnt to cook and clean and to wash regularly for myself, to be sustainable, and to be engaged in different activities, to swim often, that I learnt. I'm grateful that I had swimming lessons regularly, and that I could focus on doing the academic homework, and have a good comprehension of grammar and mathematics. I can still budget reasonably okay. I think I'm overspending too often, but that's a different issue, perhaps. There were a lot of good things learnt from the childhood, and a lot of good experiences from there too, actually. Yes, there were some sad ones and arguments as well. I know sometimes the foster parents would argue. They had their own marital issues of some sort, as all do, and all people can sometimes. But I think they both tried and worked hard for the foster children, and for me as well. They both worked hard to provide for us and provide a good material quality of life, and they did. It was always a very clean house, well provided for food, and we were well dressed and looked after. We always had clean, uniforms and nice clothing that we could wear out as well, even if there were sometimes hand-me-downs or didn't exactly fit. But sometimes, we were always well looked after. The house was heated. There were lovely animals that we had there to care for, and they all had different, characters, and they were interesting, and lots of people that visited, and there was lots of good things in that as well. People that visited and that prayed with us and that sung with us, studied with us, and occasionally argued with us, but more often went on holidays with us, and families that quite a lot of friends that got to know us all well, and that became a close part of the family too. And actually, I would say, there were a few visitors, friends of the foster parents, and also friends of other of us of the children of the family. Some friends that I got close to as well, and I would consider close friends myself of, really. There were a lot of good and bad experiences in my childhood, at the school and at house as well. So it's a whole kaleidoscope of mixed feelings, really, about different things. There were a lot of sad memories, But there were many more happy memories, on balance, if I look back, and many more good things that I learnt, really. Things that have stood the test of time and allowed me to sort of function, to care for others and myself a little. And over such a long time as well. Gosh, I'm talking about things that were 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago. So I want to focus now on my adolescent phase, on the adolescent story. But just to sort of recap, it was a mixed childhood. There were a lot of good things within it, especially within the foster parents, and how much time and energy they both really devoted to it. Whatever issues they both may have had, that they worked hard and were devoted to the family, and also in the way that they believed at the time. I know that the foster mother also had some other issues herself. They both divorced some years later. And I think we all struggled with it all, really, and we all had a lot of hard issues ourselves to work through, really. But we all sort of were focused on trying to carry on with our lives as much as we could, really. Whatever struggles we had, living together as a family, as sort of a nuclear family, there was a lot of good and bad in it, really. And I'm glad to have met everyone within it, and for all the good in all of the relations within it all. Even Sparkle, the old dog, and KB and the cats. I forget the other. Georgie, of course. How could I forget? Georgie and KB, of course. And Cola and all the other animals. We had a large conveyor belt, a conveyor belt of guinea pigs and rabbits. I couldn't remember all the names. And a poor kitten as well, wasn't there, who died on Christmas Day. Gosh, that was sad. But we had some lovely animals that were adopted. And there were other children adopted too. That was lovely to meet as well. When it was good, we could all get on quite well. We had some lovely family occasions, holidays, dinners where we entertained and had lots of other friends around that we all learnt together and had some very supportive and caring relations in the house. That's not to say there weren't a lot of arguments and serious issues where we could have all hurt each other sometimes as well, though. And there were those. But I think, like with any complicated family, with lots of people, there's bound to be lots of good and bad, isn't there? I'm sure we all do bad to harm each other, and all do angry things or say the wrong thing sometimes that, we regret. I know I do a lot, and I'm sure we all do sometimes. Especially sometimes when we were all perhaps under different strains that we didn't know about each other sometimes, I think I appreciate and respect a lot, really, Richard and Christine especially, taking on so many foster children and caring so much, giving so much of their time and energy to look after, not just their own biological children, but also me and Peter, the long-term foster children, and a great many other foster children too, that were cared for, nourished, counselled, loved, fed, watered, clothed, given songs to sing, even if they didn't know what they were or laughed at them or couldn't understand it, but given lots of interesting activities to do, activity holidays that were gone on, and given fulfilling lives that were happy, not totally perfect, but that were nourishing and adaptive and full of life. And for giving other people, younger children that don't have their own parents or whose parents were ill or in a difficult position, for just taking so much time and energy in their own way of caring and devoting so much love to younger foster children for a few weeks or a few months as often, and in mine and Peter's case for many years. Whatever issues I had with Christine and whatever difficulties we had and strains that there were in our relationship and our difficulty in understanding each other sometimes, I appreciate a lot of her hard work and effort, and that it came often from a good heart and a good place. And I still do think that of Christine, and I still love and respect that of her as well. Even if I am upset and I have serious issues about some things, she may well with me too, and that for perhaps good reason. And I've made a lot of serious issues and there's serious faults over the years, and some things I've said as well that I regret. Whatever issues there were, I still absolutely respect, and I respect all the good work and all the dedication and hard work that she did for others, especially for all the foster children. And absolutely, I feel that about Richard too. I just happened to be closer, but perhaps we were able to relate to each other more and had similar temperaments, actually. That we were both a little shy and introverted, and maybe Christine was more extroverted anyway and more outgoing. But I think whatever the other reasons as well could be, I think I recognise the good and the great hard work and loyalty and the care that Christine gave to many others in her work, for foster children and providing for a caring household. Yes, there were a lot of mistakes that were made, but I choose to look at the good in it all as well, and the love and the times that we shared that were happy. Especially with Richard and Anna as well, the foster sister. We had a lot of close times, especially as well. And we should all look at the good that we had in all our relationships. And with Daniel as well, there was some good. We had some times together. Whatever the strange occasions that there were sometimes, I'm still doubtful about, and I don't know the reasons about. I know there were times when he was supportive too. At least I felt he was at the time anyway. Well, I can only say what I feel about it and what my thoughts are and what happened. There were a lot of good things within it as well, and a lot of times that I cherish the memories of. Lots of family holidays that we've gone on, and the fact that we learnt so much. Whether we learnt some good and bad things in it is perhaps something worth considering as well. And I think perhaps we all have things that we can sort of make up to each other, and well, we may have made mistakes to each other. That can happen. But I'm grateful and I'm happy to have met everyone within it and to have had all the experiences, really. We lived together for many years, in fact, so it was in 2 different houses for over 13, 14 maybe years. So we had a whole kaleidoscope of different experiences, really, and different people that we met visiting, of course. I think about 13, 14 years, I was about that age. And then I think maybe a year or so later, Richard and Christine, the foster parents, they had divorced from each other. And the foster mother, Christine, she'd gone off to marry another partner that she'd met at the time, Bob. So she and Richard then had divorced, and she went on to marry Bob, and they obviously had moved on themselves. And I visited them and was in some contacts. And the younger foster brother, Peter, I think he was more closer to Christine and Richard, to both their foster parents. And I think he depended a lot more on Christine's support, actually. She was incredibly supportive with Peter, my younger foster brother, especially during his disability and his hardship through that. And I admire greatly just how supportive that Christine was actually during that. She was very adaptive, very considerate, hard-working for him, on behalf of him for those years. Understandably, Peter kept in closer contact with Christine and Bob at the time. They'd moved elsewhere, and I saw them a few times. And I was upset and angry and shocked at the time that Christine had decided to leave. In time, I grew to accept her reasons, and that it was probably the right reasons to leave anyway. That she felt the relationship hadn't worked for her. She was in love with someone else and wanted to be with someone else, and I understood that years later. I was hurt and upset at the time, but I think I came to accept it when I was older, and yes, it was perhaps the right thing for her to do and the right thing for the family. Yeah, but it was a hard time for her, for Richard especially, but for everyone. We all went through a hard time then, and we all came in gradually. We came in gradually in terms to accept it, I think. We all have them. Whatever's gone on before, we may have our different arguments about it and different feelings about it, but, I'm glad that we were all able to move on from it, at least. We've all been able to move on, to have relationships, to work again, and to have other houses and other places to live at, and to move on. And I wish everyone to move on and find happiness, really, and that we all forgive any hardship, any wrong that we've done to each other, really. And I'm sorry anytime if I've said anything wrong about anyone, or when I shouted sometimes angry or rude things, or when I kept quiet, I didn't say if I was actually upset, and then maybe blurted it out in the wrong time or wrong way. I'm sorry for that, actually, because I think too often at that time I was used to sort of being too quiet and introverted and keeping the peace and keeping things quieter, and not wanting to trouble each other, not wanting to trouble others, really. Perhaps I just learnt to do that, or that was just my way of coping. I don't know that anyone taught me to do that. Maybe it's just how I was able to cope with it or do it. But I tended to not talk about things so much unless I felt a real need, a real actual reason, unless it was urgent and absolutely necessary. I'd often just shy away from talking about things, not wanting to upset others. I suppose out of concern for not wanting to, provoke others into being sad or angry or. But I think I have changed a lot over the years about that. That's how I was then and dealt with things then. But obviously, you change a lot over the years. So I change in how I think and feel about things, especially, and what I would talk about. I shied away from talking about anything during those times. And I'm sorry I wasn't more open sometimes about that. And even when I was years later, sometimes, I suppose I sometimes talked about it with a heavy heart, or when I was a little bitter or angry, or when I dwelt more only on the sadder occasions, the arguments that we'd sometimes had, the fallings out that we had, and sometimes neglected to look at, some of the good occasions, all of this, so many good occasions that we had shared for many years. The good, inspiring holidays and the activity works where we all learned how to meet new groups and how to do new songs and how to cook for each other and clean for each other and how to care for one another. Lots of good things, lots of good life skills that were learned, and lots of happy memories as well. I want to be honest and say there were some sad memories as well there, for whatever reason. I mean, there's a whole variety of lots of different reasons. There were lots of issues going on at school as well as some at home, and other issues I had as well. Being a biological foster child as well, being a foster child of separated from my biological parents. I suppose that itself was a contributing factor as well. I always lived with not knowing quite what the reasons were why I was in foster care. I knew I had a foster mother at the time and that she'd been ill, but I didn't really know who she was or how she lived or what then the circumstances were after that. During the earlier childhood, when I was at the foster home with the other foster children and foster parents, then Mum had come over occasionally, irregularly to visit. I think she was still quite angry and bitter, resentful of what had happened in the past. Mum had always wanted me as well. Really, she never wanted me to be in long-term foster care. And so she was angry, aggrieved at the social workers. And some of that also, I think, led on to her being aggrieved at the foster parents too, who she saw as working with the social worker, really. I know Mum had fallen out with Christine and had issues with her parenting skills, and they'd had some arguments, or somehow, I don't know the extent of it really. And I know Mum anyway was really angry and just about the social services decision anyway. And I know the foster parents could do nothing about that. And if they hadn't been looking after me, another foster family would have been. But I'm glad that they were there as the foster parents, and for all the good they did, for all the nourishing support, the material provisions that were met well, as well as all the emotional counselling and the encouragement as well, and all the activity groups and all of the wonderful family friends that I got to meet. Whatever issues that Mum had, I think her main issues, biological Mum, Lorna, her real issues were with the social services and their decisions. She'd fundamentally disagreed with it, been angry with it right from the start. Had tried to change that and just hadn't been able to. Carried on doing the visits. It hadn't gone well for whatever reason, through some argument. And so those became irregular, and the contact had almost ceased, really. I'd stopped seeing her that regularly anyway, really. I think when we moved home and I was an older child, maybe my earlier, I don't know, I guess I was 8 or 9 actually. I forget exactly what age. She did and was allowed to write letters for some time. She called on the telephone sometimes too. Sometimes I would just be unsure. She sounded on edge, upset, really sad, having to really control her emotions and be quite restrained. And sometimes she would sound quite angry, inquisitive, like, oh, who's that? Or who was that who answered the phone? Or what was that about? Or are they listening in? Or she was really suspicious as well. And I didn't know why, and why, if she was like that, and really flittery and really jittery, I guess. I didn't know if she's mentally ill or if she was something wrong with her. Why she sounded so edgy and nervous and kind of a bit on the edge of tears and quite upset, whether she was really sad with me, if it was me talking to her that upset her or something, provoked her, or I didn't really know. Sometimes she'd be a little angry or suspicious or sad, and often be like that, and I didn't know why. I didn't know if it was down to me, the family that I was with, and her suspicions about them. She didn't really know them that well, just from occasional visits. She hadn't spent a long time talking or living with them, of course. I just didn't know really, and I was a bit irked out sometimes, unsure after her calls really. So they were sporadic. They stopped sometimes when there was concern over how I was reacting. I was a little upset after the calls. Sometimes I felt a little uncertain. Why was she so upset, or why was she asking me so many questions about certain thing, or so inquisitive about the foster parents? She didn't seem to ask much about other friends, or I don't know, or why was she sort of telling me all about this other life I didn't know, or about. She told me little about herself though, and so I was left with very little to know actually. There was a trial visit that had gone on many years earlier. I think I was a sort of middle-aged child. Well, I was in my mid-child years, really, somewhere between infant and teenagers. I'm guessing 6 or 7, 7 or 8. I don't know exactly. Much earlier vague memories from those years, really, where I went out to stay at a house, a different suburb of Bristol, and I stayed there for a few months. Unfortunately, it did not work out really, the visit. It was a long trial visit, so they had moderators, the social workers that would see mum and see me and the brother and assess us as it went along to see how the trial visit was going. They'd assessed that it was not going well, and I seemed to be upset from it, and it didn't work out. I think there were a few arguments at the house, but not. I don't remember too many in that. One perhaps with Glyn, but we mostly were just playing happy with the toys together, and I have very vague memories, but not so many from that experience, really. I'm told that I was just a little distressed and upset sometimes from the reports, and a little more withdrawn from it. So out of concern that it hadn't gone so well. Maybe it was just the situation, the circumstances that it happened in, that made it so that it didn't work so well for mum and perhaps for me as well. The fact that I was going into a new family, albeit they were my biological family, that I just didn't know anything about them. Going to a house that I didn't know the rules of, I hadn't been introduced to her or to Glyn at all, or to Barry that would be visiting, or to the new school. Just plunged into a total new situation with a new mother I didn't know, a new brother, a new school, a new house, everything totally new to me. And already at a time when I was quite uncertain, and with the unknown condition, the autism that I'd had, that was undiagnosed, no one knew anything about anyway. Even I didn't know to tell anyone about. And so with those neurological struggles, with the struggle to sort of adapt to new situations anyway, then plunged into this situation with a new biological mother, had no time to meet at mediation centre. I mean, looking back in hindsight, it would have been much better if I'd gotten to meet her, my biological mother, and the biological brother, if I'd meeting them both together at a neutral place and we'd gradually gotten to know each other more. Maybe it could have worked out differently if it had been done differently, perhaps. I think there were mistakes made, if I'm honest, in how it was done. But for whatever reasons, I don't know really. For whatever reasons, the social workers had determined from the assessments that it just wasn't in my interest, that I had been suffering or withdrawn, and they didn't feel it was right to carry on the trial visit at the time. So that only really lasted a few months. And it was when I was quite young, really. I do have some vague memories of those times. Happier ones, but going up with Mum to Nightstone building, it's a large red brick building. That's where her own elderly mother had lived. She suffered from dementia years later. I think she passed on by the time I got back in contact with Mum, though. I had vague memories playing in the hallways there with Glyn, Mum going to the garage next door, topping up to get bags of sweets for us, while we played with Nanny, Jessie McCulloch, who was Mum's biological mother, my biological grandmother, that would be. Remember going up to her and playing in this long corridor, in this long kind of room with those plastic chairs. And I remember being there with her and her sister Rose. I think there was just a friend of Mum's that would visit. Yeah, there are some memories and some photographs of those occasions too. It's nice when you can put an old photo to an actual sketchy kind of memory, isn't it? And Mum talked often of that. She used to take us up there. She said it was just so much of a struggle, and that I had some behavioural troubles, that she found it difficult to get to know me and who I was and how I was able to be. She found it more of a struggle as well, she'd admitted. And she didn't really have enough support, she said at the time, to really learn to look after a child with problems socially interacting with others, and didn't know anything about all of that. and especially being that it was another foster child as well, albeit her own biological child, but that had spent all the years before learning with someone else. Um, and without any support, she said at the time, she'd really struggled with it. So I then didn't see Mum at all for many, many years after that. I only had the vague memories, sketchy memories of those few schools. The school I went to, Holymead School, I think I went to. No, it was a different one. I forget the name now. 2 Mile Hill School that I went to there. I have a few memories of there, not so many. A few memories at the house, up at Mum's house, but very few really. And for many years that was the case. I was just relying on those vague memories for all those years really. Sketchy really. Mum remembers being attentive, cooking and cleaning often. She talked often, but I don't remember anything what it was about. Me and Glenn, I remember happily playing or something for much of the time with the toys. I don't remember any serious arguments happening really. But I was at a much younger age from earlier, so I don't really remember so much of it all. So then there were just the on-off occasional telephone calls that would happen, sometimes not for a long time, and the letters that Mum would send every birthday, knowing that I loved football and I supported Man United when I was a young teenager. I supported Bristol Rovers earlier than that, but I became a sort of glory supporter. Went for the most popular team at the time. I think Man U was the biggest team at that time. And I used to watch the games with foster father Richard and some other friends that would come over. We watched some of the big matches, screened on TV, sometimes the big Champions League match. We even went up to one of them to watch at Old Trafford. When I think Alex Ferguson's secretary, they sent us complimentary tickets, and that was really kind of them. And I was quite into football and collected Man United little figurines and the Panini book stickers and all of those that I never completed, and really into the football team and football posters on my wall and that of all the different players and the team and all this, different uniform. So Mum used to send me the football kits each birthday. She was allowed to send me the different uniform for them. Every few years, she either sent me a different kind of, a different top, the goalkeeper's top, or it would be the new sort of football shirt that they brought out or something. She sent a long letter with that every birthday. A few of them were a little angry, some of them a little upset. As she wasn't allowed to write letters on a few occasions, I think because sometimes she wrote things that were a little upsetting, or in fact her handwriting was really hard to decipher sometimes as well. I remember a few of us really puzzling over. The I's were Z's. It was very stretched, windy kind of writing. It was very hard. But sometimes she had written quite emotional things and not suitable for me at a younger age as a child, really. She had her angry feelings about the social services. She really disagreed with them taking me into care. She disagreed with their decision over it. But they then had felt, after so long I'd been with the family, that it would be better that I stayed with the family that I knew well at that point, especially after the trial visit then hadn't worked out. They had tried to do that, albeit perhaps with not enough support, but when that didn't work out, it would seem better just to keep me with the family that I seemed to be doing reasonably okay with, just to monitor if things seemed to get worse. But they then kept on staying and visiting infrequently, but they didn't always allow Mum contact because they felt then sometimes there were reasons that she shouldn't be allowed the personal contact, and there were a couple of reasons to justify that, really. So yes, well, there was one occasion when she turned up out the blue, and that was at my school. I was at the secondary school at the time, and I just was completely shocked, really. I was just in there with a group of classmates. We were heading out to one of the outbuildings. They used to have these little huts in the school playing field, so you had to go outside to access it. So I was wandering out with the other class students. I think it was a maths teacher at the time, Mr. Swain, I think it was. Anyway, he was sort of leading us all out there. We were going out to the maths hut for our lesson, and then I just heard somebody call me across the playground, shouting out, "Niko!" And a couple of times I looked around, and there in the distance was Mum that I could remember, vaguely looked familiar, because I could recall her from the vague memories of the trial visit from those years earlier. And I saw her dashing towards me across the concrete playground, stumbling over. Glyn was just stood off a little bemused to the side, grabbed me, gave me the biggest hug I've ever had, wrapped me round. She looked delighted, and more than that, she yelled out, gave me a bear hug, and then she was almost in floods of tears. She just seemed overwhelmed emotionally. She seemed so glad to see me, and incredible. And then she was full asking me all these questions. By that point, the maths teacher, Mr. Swain, had reappeared because he obviously heard, like all the classmates, like all staring over, like wondering, what's that? What's happened? He'd sent them all off to the maths hut at that time to go in, um, and then just come over to us. And then he obviously asked Mum, who are you? What's going on, all this? Mum had said, oh, this is my son. I had to come and see him, you know, and he looked really confused by it. She said, because I couldn't see him except through here. They weren't allowing me to see him elsewhere or something. The maths teacher, Mr. Swain, looked really confused at it. He ushered us in and said, well, let's go to the head of year and talk about this, find out what's going on then. And he took us over there, back over to the larger school building. We waited in a small reception area. And while we waited for Mr. Swain to go over and get the actual head of year, Mum was asking loads of questions of me. I think Glyn must have been sat with us. She was asking how I was, what I'd been up to. I just remember asking her questions and that she was really upset, but she also just seemed delighted as well. I've mixed emotions. She just was asking me lots of questions until the head of year had suddenly arrived. Then we went into the office with him. And once he discovered that Mum actually hadn't got a right to see me, and that she wasn't the legal guardian at that point. She was the biological parent, just trying to get her back in contact with me. He then didn't know the situation, so then had to contact the foster parents. So I think it was that impromptu visit that she wasn't meant to go on. She'd actually been banned from actually seeing me and making contact with me at that point, so she really wasn't allowed to do that. There was a reason why she wasn't allowed to contact me, though, or to have any personal contact with me. In the years earlier than that, I think, and I don't really remember exactly how many years, really, I had been allowed escorted leave, so Mum had been able to see me escortedly, like with a social worker present too, if it was a supervised encounter. So there have been a few occasions, and I don't know how many. Sorry. There have been a few visits. We went out to a cafe on one occasion, and it was a high street cafe that we gone out to, actually. And I'm okay, just take my breath a bit. My neck's in a bit of pain. We got out to this high street cafe with Mum and the social worker. It was for this mediated, supervised sort of meetings that we had sometimes with her. And as we were out in the cafe, totally unexpected, just never imagined it would happen. I think the social worker was out at the toilets at the time, so he was distracted going out with that. And then Mum had just taken us off, and she went off with me and Glyn. I think he was with us also, yeah. And she rushed off with us, rushed out of the cafe door, tried to make off with us down the high street. She obviously attempted to take off with me at the time. I didn't know where she was going to go, and that the social worker, coming back early enough to find the table at the cafe empty, rushed out the door after her, chased her down the street. Well, with two younger children, both of us at an earlier age, she was unable to get far down the crowded high street anyway, before the social worker caught up with her, and that was that. So she was then seen as a risk. She wasn't able to have even supervised contact with me anymore as a foster child, in case she might try it again or do it, try and abduct me, as it was seen to be doing again. Fortunately, no charges were ever pressed against her. They were lenient against her, and that because it was seen that, she was sad. It was a sad case of what happened to her, really. And I felt very sorry for her too, actually. It's enough to make you really sad, actually, to think what happened. The poor woman, she'd been very ill and had cancer, had a hysterectomy, was seriously ill during the pregnancy, down to 5 stone in weight, and had a serious illness after the operation for some months. And through no fault of her own, really, had lost the child and was never able to later bond with the child later on anyway, during the trial visit, because so many years had passed. For whatever reason, through her own ill health and the cancer, just was detached and not able to have the child she'd given birth to me. So she'd struggled with that for some years. And she was just really desperate to get in contact with me and to see me again. It didn't make any sense rationally. It didn't make any, and it was the wrong thing to do in one sense. I think if I look back on it, I think she didn't think through it logically. It didn't make any rational sense. I did many years later ask her about it. She said she didn't know where she was going to take us or what she was going to do or where she would go, except back to her own house. She'd not thought it through at all. She just knew that she desperately wanted to see me and start a relationship with me after so many years and so much longing and desperation. That was all, really. She'd not thought it through at all, really. I did accept and I believed it came from a nice and a loving place in the heart, and even if it had not been thought through and it was irrational and crazy and stupid, I said that to her myself, and she wouldn't be offended. I said it was a lovely, beautiful thing in some ways, and I'm sorry that she was desperate and longing enough and driven to such lengths, even if, however irrational it was. I guess once she tried it once, she knew that it wouldn't work, and it was a bad thing to carry on. And she thankfully never pursued it, and knew that after then getting support with it and realizing it wouldn't work out, she never did do it again, never. And she had to then, I guess that was she had to try that to know and to finally accept there was nothing she could do, and she had to accept that. But she continued, longing and hoping and trying. She did try and call, and she called as much as she could and was able to. The foster parents were very enabling and they tried to support it. But I think that she struggled, and I struggled too, making contact with each other and even relating to each other that much, just with so much separation after so many years, really. And so perhaps that's also partly why the child visit didn't work, and that she didn't know anything about my emotional situation and hadn't known me for those years, didn't know, and I didn't know anything about her. If we gradually got to know each other, if it had been different, maybe it would be different. So there was a reason why Mum was barred then from visiting, just for the fear that she might try it again. And I don't know if that was right or not, but I can understand their concern that next time she might go off and take me to another place, take a greater risk, or try and run away to somewhere that might be more risky, or that might... for whatever reason, I feel desperately sorry for the position that she was in. I feel like it was a wrong thing to do and a stupid thing in some ways, because it sometimes meant she then wasn't able to have more regular supervised contact that she could have had over some years. But I accept as well, from getting to know her some years later, not only did she have the longing and that desperation to reconnect with her son that she'd been missing from for some years, she also had her own neurological issues as well. She had brain cyst when she was born. She was born with some sort of egg in the brain. It's called a brain cyst, and that gave her some neurological brain problems. She'd always had those sort of neurological problems as I'd known her. It took me many years to get to know that. She had a sort of neurotic problem of some sort in sort of managing and regulating emotions, really. So maybe that also put an additional strain. There were other factors that could influence it as well in her life as well. If she was with others that could support her or not, what her family circumstances were, and how she was getting older and able to deal with things differently. Maybe at an earlier point, when she'd lacked support sometimes and felt more desperate and driven to those lengths and less able to deal with it sometimes, perhaps. Yes, it's sad that happened, because then we couldn't regularly maintain even a supervised contact. And so it was very strange when I decided to get back in contact with her at an early adolescent age, I think. And I think it felt right to do that at that time, really. The foster parents had sort of moved on, really. They both divorced and separated. And they both went on to remarry and have other relations, thankfully, themselves. And the foster mother herself had moved on, that I had a bit of a strained relation with sometimes. And so I was living at the home alone with foster father Richard was still living there at the time. I was going out working. I had worked for several years, just doing some shop work, really. And for years before that, I always had my paper round anyway. I gave that up at some point, so going on to do shop work, really. And I did that for the last year or two of GCSEs even as well, I think, the last couple of years of schooling. Then I became doing more full-time working, Still doing the shop work, really. I was going on working in a Tesco store, actually. I was doing vegetable stock rotation, cleaning, getting out stuff from the big freezers, unloading, rotating stock, presenting different produce and that. Trying to give people directions to places, though I wasn't that good at that. I hope I didn't send people to too many of the wrong aisles. But so I was a stock rotator, working part-time at the local supermarket. Done a bit of shop work. I think I still did paper rounds sometimes. I still went out to a college class where I went out to study at the time as well. So I was a bit more of a young, independent adult at the time, working, studying. The foster mother had moved on a year or so earlier with a relationship. I think they'd moved towns at some point as well. And I visited them less often. And it just felt a good time to go and really try out and see who this biological mother was, that I had all the vague trial memories from, or the vague memories of the trial visit, that I had just a few letters that were hard to decipher of, that one visit at a school, just half an hour memory of, all these small vague memories that I had, or lots of vague memories, but from so long ago. I decided to go and see this mysterious biological mother once and for all to try and figure out who she was, and what relationship I had to her. Seemed like a good time to try it out, really, because I was going out much more, out of the house, out of the neighbourhood. Had my bike at that time, so I was cycling longer distances, going out a couple of miles, cycling. So reasoned I could cycle the journey myself, and yeah, I thought it'd be good to make contact with her. I was quite curious after all the memories and all the contacts, all the birthday presents and letters over the last few years. Just curious to know who she was, really, and why she'd given me up, why she'd had to, and also to know if she wanted to start a relationship, because I really wanted to find a motherly relationship. I was interested to know if she wanted that, if it could be possible. I didn't know, really. I suppose curiosity drove me to do it, really. And I did make contact, and I think I was probably about age 14, 15, I suppose mid-teens, really, about that age. No, maybe I was a bit older. I'd done the exams, got the GCSEs out the way, so I must have been 15, 16, perhaps a little older. Perhaps I was 16 or so, actually, thinking about it. Yeah, the GCSEs were done, and I was out going to college. I was doing a computer CLATE course, so I was learning more about computing. When I wasn't at home watching kind of cheesy soap operas, sort of sensational, dramatic ones, I think Sunset Beach and things, I was sort of scarping at home watching sometimes. Taking the dog out for long walks in the park. There was a local friend that I would see occasionally at the time. I was getting a bit more independent going out then as well. There was Freedom Youth, and I would go out and see. That was it was a local youth group. It was a local youth group for people with LGBT issues at the time that I was going through. So I spent about a year going to this Freedom Youth, that they were called, for LGBTQ youth, because I was curious about my sexuality at that time as well. So I was going out to Freedom Youth occasionally, meeting some more friends through there, and I met a couple of close friends, especially through there. Going out to the college class and learning about computing. I did a leisure and tourism class, then changed that and went on to doing some more basic computer classes, learning about Word, Excel, and also learning to sort of use the internet and just sort of be more computer literate, because I actually then went on to doing telephonic working, where I went into doing basically working in IT, doing data gathering, that sort of work, and customer support, but with using computing to a limited extent. So I was doing computer classing, the shop work. Yeah, enjoying going out and meeting new people, new friends at the Freedom Youth at the time. And so going out a lot more, it felt like a good time to go out and get to know Mum and reconnect, find out who she was. I'd had that curiosity for a year or so, and I wasn't occupied by the exams at school or any other issues at school, had all that now behind me. So then I could go on and focus on it, really. It was only a part-time college class that I was doing around the work, and the part-time work at the shops that I was doing at the time. So I felt I was quite relaxed at the time. I was curious and going out, meeting new friends at the youth group. And I had the time and desire to want to go out and meet Mum and find out who she was. And I wasn't under a lot of pressure at the time. I didn't have the strained relationships then, so it felt a really good time to do that. Remember when I called up Rini? I thought it was Mum at first. I was really, really amazed and a bit confused by it all, actually. Well, because I've been given a telephone number that Mum had. What I didn't realise at first, though, is that Mum didn't have a telephone. She just went out and borrowed an old sister's phone. It was an older auntie figure of Mum's. She was really like Mum's surrogate mother because she wasn't so close to our biological paternal grandmother, Jessie McCulloch, Mum's mum. So Mum, oh Lorna used to go down to visit our Rini, who really I got to know her over a year, over a decade or so, probably 15 years of visiting Mum. She remained Mum's close motherly figure, like surrogate Mum, really. They were really close. Mum used to visit her and a couple of other older women religiously, really, kind of a couple of days every week for years on end. They knew each other's families really well. They gossiped and chatted and counselled each other on everything, really. They were like the old smoking old wives together, really. Mum's little support group, really. And our Auntie Rini, as she was to Mum. There was Edna and there was a few others. I don't know all their names, but a few others, Reen and Mum's friend, that were close enough to them, in and out of the houses, until a few had passed on. Reen's family, Mum knew quite well. Many of her sons, a few of them that had moved on, she knew a little well, and a few of the other aunt figures. And when I'd rung up Aunt Reenie, Mum's sister friend, I was a little shocked, mystified at first. Well, I thought it was Mum's phone, and I wondered if it was actually Mum who'd answered or a friend. She had a really old man's croaky voice because she smoked real heavily. It was like, "Hello, who's that?" It was just a really throaty, croaky voice. But anyway, I learnt it was old Aunt Reenie at the time, who was Mum's older friend. She said, "Oh, your mum will be delighted. She'd love it." Anyway, I can't do her voice well. It was an older, croaky voice. She was really, really happy at the time, though, she said, "Your mum will never believe it. I will tell her as soon as she visits. We'll give the message," because she took all messages from Mum. Mum used to go there and borrow the phone often, They'd have a smoke and a chat and a gossip and have dinner together. She used to do a bit of cleaning for her. And they read women's magazines together and entered into competitions with each other and those sort of things. They used to write the answers to different competition questions and try and come up with answers together and those sort of things. She was really quite nice to chat to in that. So Rini said, "Yeah, I'll get your mum to call you back." And she had. Mum had called me, and I was just amazed, really. Um, and she said the time and place to meet. I said I could cycle over on the bike, okay? And it was just such an emotional visit. I guess more for Mum than me at first, because she'd known about me all those years and longed for me, whereas I hadn't, of course. I'd known of her. I hadn't really longed for her, just because I hadn't really known who she was, and was a little wary about her because of the limited experiences, and just because of how she seemed emotional so much of the time on the phone sometimes, and I wasn't sure why that was. She was deeply emotional, burst into tears on seeing me, grabbed me, hugged me. It was a very incredibly emotional experience for her, and for me too. It was kind of bizarre and mystifying. Really, I had to take a lot of time to think about it. Really, it was strange. It was the most incredibly strange thing in my life to actually be meeting your mother at age 15. I think it was 15 or 16, roughly that age. Bizarre. So you're the person that gave birth to me, you know. And I didn't get to hear a lot about her illness or all the struggles she'd had over those many years. For the first few occasions, we didn't talk much about it, actually. However emotional it was, we both made quite an effort to be quite polite and restrained, and we really just talked about the most immediate things. I talked a lot about my college class that I was doing, the computer class, leisure and tourism class that didn't work out, and the IT class I'd swapped it for. The work at the supermarket, I talked about briefly. I talked about youth group friends that I had, different relations, foster father Richard I got on with, and I talked about what the other foster family members were up to, and some other friends that I talked about. Just things in the immediate time, not the history in the years before. I hadn't gone into in any depth, and neither did Mum talk that much either about her past either then. She just talked about her and Glenn and the friendship and the biological father, Barry, that he still visited. She still cooked him dinners when he visited regularly anyway. She had a lovely, pristine house. She was obviously house proud. It was incredibly well decorated, a little bit too busy and chaotic for my liking. Ultra floral is how I describe it, with just bouquets everywhere you looked. I think somebody said was like the Chapel of Rest or something. And I thought, yes, it's exactly like that. There were like 15 or so, like giant bouquets of ornamental flowers, great beautiful flowers, each and of themselves, ostentatious almost, with this swirl of busy, colourful fabric on the walls behind it, and these giant sofas with all these floral decorated landscape. It was a bit too busy for me, but it was extremely beautiful in its own way, though. And it was very comforting and warm, and it was actually quite snug and well insulated. And she kept it all to a really high, clean standard anyway. It was a nice, big, spacious lounge that she had, always entertaining there. And on the first few occasions, of course, over the next few months, mostly just meeting the biological brother and the biological father too, Glenn and Barry, me and Lorna, the four of us would have dinner together. The first time as a small nuclear biological family. First time that we'd ever done. We only really had dinner together as a family probably half a dozen times. We were all very polite, amenable, talking to each other, civilised, just listening to each other. A little small talk about our work and making some jokes and just having a little light banter, really, a little light chat. I wouldn't say none of us got to know each other that well to have really deeper conversations or not at great length, but we had very polite chats, just friendly chats at the table over dinner a few times. I was chatting to Mum downstairs at greater length. She was asking me a lot of different questions, more about friendships, if I was in any relationships. I said I wasn't, of course. And I wasn't really at that point. Later on, I started seeing a few people. Well, I started seeing someone and then someone else. But Mum was much more full of questions. The biological father was much quieter, more introverted. He hardly asked me many things, really, if I'm honest. I had very limited time with Barry, actually, the biological father. Probably, if I add it up, I probably spent about, in total, 5 hours with him talking. So very little. And and with him alone, even less than that, actually. Mostly I was with Mum during the course of that. He often, in the visits, was upstairs with Glyn. Sometimes they were trying out some of the different computer games together. They were just playing games that they'd often done. I think I did a couple of times with them, sometimes the three of us, on a few occasions. Just, playing around racing car games, I think some of them were, or just different platform games, just having a little chat and just having a drink, and just sort of, Glenn, who knew a lot of these computer games, was showing me, and Barry knew a few of them, and, we didn't do it for that long, really. He then came downstairs, Barry, and talked a little bit with me. Me and Mum had been sat there, talking at length about some things, my college class, a few friends that I had. Mum told me about her jobs, the work she did around the house, the dancing that she loved, a few of her friends and things. Told me a little bit about her illness and things. Never went into too much depth about anything, really. We just had some, family polite chats, really, getting to know each other, really. Barry came down occasionally, hardly talked much to him, really. He was mostly quite quiet during those occasions, listening to me and Mum chat, or Mum interview me at length and me trying to give honest answers and not be too embarrassed. The television was on, the three of us were watching programmes sometimes. I remember we watched Eurovision, and it was the year that Dana International for Israel happened to win. And Mum had made some joke or something at the time and saying, "Don't you find her really attractive?" And I remember Barry, the biological father, had said, yes, she was, he admitted. He felt that she did seem attractive. And I said she was as well. Mum was laughing at us, saying, because we didn't know Dana at that point was actually transgendered and had been born a man or something, that Mum seemed to find funny and strange to her. But we watched the song contest and all the different performances and that, and we were chatting with each other during it as well. Mum was very happy and trying to encourage us both to talk more and that. I tried to ask a few questions. He told me about what his job was, working at a factory, but told me very little, to be honest. Just gave short, abrupt replies, really. He did ask me about what college classes I was doing, how they were going, but that's it, really. Not much more than that. Maybe asked me a couple of questions, and that was that. And the time that he left then, I think I only saw him 5 occasions, probably about that. There were a couple of occasions that we had dinner, Mum was most often talking, or me and Glyn were talking sometimes as well, or answering Mum's questions sometimes. Or sometimes me and Mum were there with him and he was just sat watching the telly, or me and Mum were just chatting. So very little that he talked at all during it. Probably only amounted to a few hours with him, really. And I had no idea when he left on that occasion, the biological father, that that would be the last time I'd ever see him again. That he would go missing, or missing to us at least, that none of us would ever know or see anything about him. 25 years on. So I was quite shocked that that would happen. At the beginning, I suppose I imagined that I'd start getting to know them both gradually and that we might both sort of gradually build up a relationship. And I did with Mum, and that had begun then. She'd asked lots of questions. We'd both gotten to know a little about each other over those few hours. Well, over what was, half a dozen meetings, really. Each time it would be an hour or a few hours. So over 10 or 12 or 15 hours, however long. What was over some months. I suppose, yes, I felt like over that part of the year was getting to know them both, and I felt that would just continue. I didn't know, I never imagined that it would stop in any way, actually. I didn't know, though. I hadn't really thought of it. So on that occasion that we last saw him, I didn't think anything that different or that strange of it, really. He left on his bicycle. I mean, that's one thing we had in common. And Glyn also. I mean, the three of us always loved cycling. And I'd cycled over to the house, funnily enough. And so he had asked me one or two things about cycling, thinking about it now on the bike. I remember asking him about the jobs that he was doing. He worked at an industrial factory and that. Told me about where he was living, fat in fish ponds, marina gardens and that. And that was the last time I saw him at Mum's house. He left on the bike. He gave me £50. That was very kind of him. And said he hoped that my college class was going well. So that was the last time I saw him then. But he asked very few questions and that. And Mum was having some issues, I think later that year, some months later. She'd asked me to go over to visit biological father's house, to visit Barry's house. So I went over there with her. And she went over. She was a bit upset about some other issues. She wanted to have a private talk with him, but wanted me to escort her over there. She was feeling a bit unsteady on her legs. I think wanted some emotional support as well, really. And we were getting on much closer at that time anyway, actually. So I was happy to accompany her over there. And didn't really get to talk to him much there, really. Mum had her chat with him about whatever the concerns were. But that was the last time I saw him, actually, at his house. Didn't talk to him at all, really. Just had a little peek round the door, looked inside the bedsit where he lived, and saw that he had lots of sci-fi DVDs, loads of them, had piles of them. He's obviously an avid sci-fi fan, really. That was the last time I would ever see him again, really. When Glenn went next to visit him, because he sometimes did go to visit our father's house and that, he wasn't there anymore, so he'd left at that point, but he gave no forwarding address. So he had obviously chosen not to keep in contact with us at the time, and we don't know why he left at the time. He had some contact with Glyn for the years before that, but I guess that had been less over the years, and had never any real long-term contact with me at all, really. I'd only seen him those few occasions. So when I went to see biological mum, when I went to see Lorna, I got to meet the biological father briefly on a number of occasions, but only talked to him in a limited amount and not in any depth, really. And I regret that now, really. If I'd known that it was just going to be a limited number of occasions, I perhaps would have asked much more, really. And I felt unsure why he didn't ask more. I was kind of more waiting for him, perhaps, being the older father, to sort of take more interest and ask more of me. But I was surprised that he didn't. And then equally surprised when he just disappeared. When Glyn and then Mum had told me, he's not in his old flat when he lived at before, and he's left and he's gone and he's not left any address of that. But I couldn't really be sad about it or miss him. I couldn't really grieve for him. I couldn't really feel upset in any way because I didn't know him really. So it felt, I had the foster father that I'd been in contact with all the years before then, I suppose. And I'd never had any contact with the biological foster father at all. So I can't really miss someone that I never really got to know anyway. I suppose in a weird way I miss getting to know him because I got to know biological mum. I got to know Lorna really well over 25 years. But I should never know the reasons why I couldn't get to know Barry, or why he disappeared at that time and place. Mum didn't know, even my brother Glenn didn't know, the biological brother. None of the rest of the biological family, those I could contact, Mum certainly didn't know. And we never got to talk to any of his other friends to find out why. He seemed to be quite mysterious, introverted, and quite aloof, quite on his own a lot of the time. So we're never able to know why he went missing or why he chose not to keep in any contact with us, I suppose. Well, I was in contact still at the time with the foster father, Richard, some of the time at least, because I'd been staying on at the house there. He knew that I'd gone over to visit Lorna, and I visited her sometimes, and he encouraged me in doing that, as did others as well, actually. I stayed on living at the old foster family house for about a year or so afterwards. Where I stayed on there, I was doing the work at the time, and also the computer course too. Um, but then I decided that I wanted to move out. I met a good friend at Freedom Youth, and that we were very close together. And the foster father had helped me to move out there and was really accommodating in driving out all the bags and all the things, and supportive and actually encouraging me to work and trying to be more independent. I'd found a full-time job to provide for myself at the time. So I'd gone into working full-time customer service while I was working as an usher at the time. So I worked full-time in a cinema, cooking, cleaning, serving customers, that sort of thing, really. I loved working at the box office at the time. So I could sell tickets to customers, introduce them into films, take them up to their seat, usher them in to the dark cinema, make sure they find the right place, get to the right seat, especially when it was busy. I loved doing all that. And I loved the colleagues. It was a real family unit. It was a small cinema, so we were all really close. We worked well together. And I loved it. It was a really great first full-time job to plunge into. It was great for me. It was good. I could bus into town. It was easy to get to. I got on really well, and I got quite close to a few colleagues. It was a lovely team to work with. It was a really family kind of atmosphere to work with. Everyone clean together. Yeah, there were some yucky, hard jobs and that, but it wasn't always ideal. And I also loved working with the public, with other people, and it gave me a good way to sort of learn how to get on with other people. It gave me enough money to pay all the bills and to share a flat with someone else so that I could pay all the bills, gas, electric, and so on. So it was a great first job to go into. And I met a really good friend, Michael. We were very close together. We met at Freedom Youth, and we just moved in together just to try it out and just to sort of learn how it was to live independently, really. We got on very well. We had a lot of similar subjects. We both had a love of football. We're a little athletic. I guess I wasn't that athletic, really. My job kept me fit anyway because of all the cooking and, well, not cooking, the cleaning. I did make nachos up and things, I suppose. Um, but yeah, because I was on my feet, wandering around, walking a lot and cleaning a lot. So it was fairly physical. Me and Michael were good friends though, and we got on well when we moved out together. The problem is we got on really well before we moved in well together. As friends, when we went out together, seeing each other, we got on well, chatting with others together, dancing with others, just having fun. We had similar subjects we liked to talk about. We got on with similar people. We liked going out to dance and meet others. We liked chatting with others that we got on well with. When we were out socializing, we got on really well outside. I think we both just had a struggle living together, cramped up in what was quite a small room it was a couple of rooms that we were sharing, and one of us ended up going to live in the other lounge actually. So we ended up just becoming only kind of platonic friends after that, when we had been a bit more involved before then. But it really just worked out as good friends, right, really, and we just stayed together as that, really, until we were a little argumentative, and I think it was just being too close together that it was difficult. Then we both needed our own personal space, really. And when we had that more, we went back to being really good friends again, actually. And we'd always been close friends. We hit it off right from the beginning, right from when we first just got on. And yeah, we clicked straight away, and we just chatted with other people that we got on with okay as well. It was nice having someone I could relate to well. And, it didn't work out like having a real close, intimate relationship and living too closely together. But we tried it out. And when we discovered it didn't work out, after we started arguing, getting on each other's nerves, and I think we were both causing a little frustration for each other because we both had different ideas of how we wanted the flat to be, and it was almost a competition between us. I went and decorated the walls with all my cinema posters one day, and he took them all down another day, and put up his own thing. And we both kind of argued for a little while, but we learned how to get on with each other, and we learned that we just couldn't live that intimately. We weren't suited to have such a personal relationship with each other anyway, that we were better off as friends. We discovered that, but we discovered it while we were still living to each other. So, yeah, it made sense. And do you know what? We still got on well with each other even after that. And I think that was a really mature thing to have to learn to do, actually, to sort of respect each other's choices to invite a partner back there, and just to allow each other to be happy and not to be judgmental and angry with each other. Even when we were frustrated and having to share bathrooms, share a hallway still, and still share, conversation with each other sometimes. We were good as friends though, and we still kept friends. And I think we were better friends, much better friends than when we were in separate houses, actually. Um, we were still respectful in our arguments. We still didn't harm each other that much. And I think when we stayed there and we were getting frustrated at each other, we both needed to go out more and we saw other people a lot more. And I think actually it worked out that we forgave each other and we just gave each other more space. And that eventually when we moved out, it worked out that we stayed friends, really, you know. But I'm glad, and I am glad for the experience. Actually, it was a great time to move out. While I was working in that job, I loved the relationship and job. We were great friends, even if the friendship didn't work out as we first thought it would, and it just became a nice friendship in the end. Um, and by that time, while we were friends, I'd been able to go out more regularly and to meet other friends. We both had, and that's what was a great thing about it, that we were able to support each other, going out to meet each other more, because I was in a comfortable place then, so I could go out and meet a lot of other people. And there were a couple of groups then that I was going out and seeing regularly. Then I went out. There was a small group from Freedom Youth that I then went out to a pub and we saw each other regularly. And from that group, I kept in contact with them over many years. So that was a real great support group. And I went and moved in with a couple over the years, actually, as well. So it was really good to be able to sort of meet a whole group and a whole variety of other people to be friends with, really. Because I'd never really been friends with a whole group of lots of people suddenly. It was just a new kind of experience, a new liberating experience, really. I loved the whole time, actually, of meeting so many people over the next few years. It was a really the springtime of my life, actually, emerging out of um, a, a kind of wintry spring into a more summery spring, where it would be. I describe it as a liberation, where I was like meeting a whole variety of people and having joyful, happy encounters, relationships. Suddenly, I was actually meeting friends for the first time in my life, groups of friends that I could connect to, that I could live with, that I could travel with, that I could work with sometimes. Not always work with, though, but sometimes I met some colleagues that I got close friends with, but usually that I lived with and partied with and travelled with and went on nights out dancing with often. That's usually what. I had so many happy house parties, and over the next few years, and I had some really happy house stays. I lived with some really great friends that became like family to me, really, and groups of friends that would visit regularly. Not just lots of house parties, counselling sessions. People just, well, we got to talk to each other, have a chat with each other, having friendly chats regularly. They were lovely years of my life, really, full of lots of friendship groups that visited the house regularly, and I went out regularly. I went out studying for those years. I went in the end. I went back to do my A levels, actually, to study them. But I was out meeting a group that I went dancing with. Dancing, chatting. We'd go out and meet people on the weekends. Used to go out a couple of nights a week with the group. There was a group from Freedom Youth I went out with, and then also another group as well, who were housemates, friends, and friends of friends. They sort of merged to become a different, sort of separate group eventually, a branch off the original group, really. So there were kind of several groups that I was really friendly with and seeing quite regularly. Those were really happy years in my life in many ways, and I'm so grateful that I was able to have so many personal relationships, so many friendly relationships, and a few romantic relationships from those years as well. No, I didn't have that many. I guess there were probably one, two, definitely three or four from those years, from the adolescent years. from 16 up to my early 20s. I think there were, well, there are definitely three, but perhaps four very romantic relationships. There may well have been five, but one that I never actually was able to sort of have any romantic relationships with at the time, but that only matured and became more romantic many, many years later, actually. But there was only ever friendship during this time. So, but I had a number of different romantic relationships during the adolescent years, up to my early 20s, when I stopped having any romantic relations after that for time. I was fortunate enough to have lots of different friends, a few different friendship groups, and a few different colleagues as well that I got on with and that became friends. That weren't part of the friendship groups, but friends anyway. So I was glad to meet lots of new acquaintances that became friends, and have loads of friends at the time. Something I never had before that, actually. It was a new thing to me in my life, and I am eternally grateful to have all of those friends that I met in those years, and to have known them all, and to have known so many different friends, and all the different relationships. Um, each one on their own have given me something different, something interesting, and added something that's enriched my life, really. And so I'm grateful for all of them.